Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending Merkle Meets. This month's topic is the LEA webinar. We have a pretty good agenda here for you guys today. So I'll walk everyone through the quick agenda. We'll do some intros, and then we'll jump right into the content. I know this is a very exciting topic, so we'll leave it to the experts here to cover some of those topics. But for today, we're primarily going to be covering recent trends, typologies, laundering tactics in crypto crime. Obviously, we've seen that there's been a huge uptick in crypto crime, so we've brought in the right experts here. We'll cover what the investigation process typically looks like, what are some of the challenges and pain points that investigators have, how are cases built, prioritized, and then how typical asset recovery works in crypto. What are some of the challenges there? And then most importantly, how can this be used in prosecution? How do we take some of this evidence, bring it to court, and how do we train our staff members and investigators on the right tools, techniques, and methodologies for mitigating some of these risks, and obviously following up and making sure that we prosecute those malicious actors. So to get started, I'd like to introduce the panelists as well as just a quick intro on Merkle Science. So Merkle Science is a blockchain analytics company. We primarily focus on cryptocurrencies, on-chain and off-chain risks. So we typically hold this Merkle Meets webinar once every couple of months. Today's topic is one that was highly requested. So we were able to get two experts in the industry to join us. So first and foremost, we have Matthew Swenson, who is the Chief Executive Officer over at Black Rainbow Group. And we have Justin Maile, who's the CEO at CipherBlade. I'll pass it over to them to do quick intros, and everyone else, please make sure to use the chat if you have any questions. We'll try to get to all of the questions in real time. If not, then we'll probably get to as many as we can at the end of the session, and we'll follow up with the panelists if there's any other specific questions that you guys have. So with that said, let's get started. I'll pass it over to Matthew for a quick intro. So Matthew, over to you.
Hey, great to meet everybody. Thanks for having me. So my name is Matt Swenson. I was the federal agent. I worked for Homeland Security Investigations for just over 20 years. Toward the end of my career, I was the division chief at the HSI Cybercrime Center in the Washington, D.C. area, where I oversaw all cyber, digital forensics, child exploitation investigations, and cyber training and engagement units. A couple of the groups specifically that I oversaw were our crypto analytics and tracing group, and then also our cyber threat intelligence group. So often those two groups would work in tandem to trace illicit assets pertaining to various Homeland Security investigations, and then do threat actor attribution. So try and take things through open source intelligence and law enforcement databases to be able to hopefully get a picture on ownership as to the illicit currency, the cryptocurrency that we were looking at. Now I'm at a investigative case management company, Black Rainbow, where I serve as the CEO of North America. So again, thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Matt. And then over to Justin.
Hi, and thanks for having me. I'm Justin Maile, CEO of CipherBlade. I've been conducting crypto investigations professionally now for about 7 years. Before that, I did network vulnerability testing and pen testing before I switched over to crypto. I worked at Chainalysis first. I worked there for over 5 years, leading the investigation team. Joined beginning of 2018. Took over leading that team about a year later. And then we grew that team to almost 70 people at its peak. I've worked on some of the biggest cases over the last decade, including the takedown of Welcome to Video, the $2 billion BitConnect Ponzi scheme case, supporting SEC there. the Twitter verified account takeover and the subsequent crypto scams that followed. And then most of the exchange hacks over the last 7 years, I've looked at those as well. I helped develop the chain analysis investigator training courses while I was there in that certification path. Was responsible for authorizing the investigation partners and essentially training them up to be able to do what the investigation team did there. And I helped to develop the investigation workflow and many of the techniques and pattern recognition and the report format that's now fairly standard in the industry. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Justin. So let's just dive right into it. So Justin, I know you have a few slides prepared for the audience here. So I'll pass it over to you to quickly just give us some context on what's been going on in the space and of course, anything else you want to cover here.
Certainly. Thanks, Neal. Let me share my screen real quick. Okay. Can everyone see the slides here?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Just a little background here about CipherBlade as well. Founded in 2018 also. We've got 3 offices currently, one based out of Alaska, which is our North American office, Singapore, as well as a Cyprus office. Formerly had a UK office, but we've closed that one down and hopefully opening one up in Brazil early next year. We have a team of highly trained and experienced investigators speaking 9 different languages. We've investigated billions of dollars of stolen fund cases and scam cases and helped to recover millions. We try not to advertise that we recover. We don't want to give people the wrong impression that we're a recovery firm. We're a forensic investigation firm. As a result of that support to law enforcement, we do help them get recoveries for victims, though. And we'll go over the process of how that works later in the presentation. Providing a range of different services, including support for civil cases, divorce cases, just regular expert witness, as well as training. And we've used every tool on the market at this point. But we're proud to say that we are only partnered with Merkle Science. So I've got a couple of just sample questions here. I wanted to go through the kind of set the tone here. So some of the critical areas where I think law enforcement knowledge maybe falls a little bit short or where there's some gaps when it comes to crypto crime. One of the biggest challenges there is the highly international nature of crypto. One of the things that causes some of the most challenge is working some of these big scam cases, especially the romance scams, the Shazzupan scams. They're often very international. They're targeting victims in all sorts of countries, Europe, the US, but a lot of them are being run out of APAC. And so that causes some issues for some law enforcement agencies who are trying to investigate this, not really sure how they request information from some of these international exchanges. So, and often they don't, their default isn't to, work with some of these other international law enforcement agencies. There's, in some cases, we've seen maybe a little bit of territorialness, when it comes to we're supporting these victims only, and sometimes it's they just haven't worked with Hong Kong police, for example, or anything like that. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges is getting to that mindset where you really need to work internationally to successfully investigate these cases and prosecute these criminals. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges there. Next, understanding the emergence of bridges and swaps. I think we see bridges, swaps, token swaps, chain hopping. We see that in more cases than not these days. It's fairly trivial, from a forensic perspective to follow this and to trace through these swaps. But it does cause some confusion sometimes with when working with law enforcement, especially when we're trying to explain, these are the stolen funds, but they were then bridged over here, and then they swap with these tokens, and basically just explaining that flow, and how we're still confident that these are still the same, essentially the same stolen assets. That sometimes causes some issue, just when it comes to explaining that. But in terms of just following it and tracing it and explaining that, that's actually fairly trivial. In terms of, I took this next example question, from our slides there, but evaluating the shift to layer 2 chains, we do see some stolen assets on layer 2 chains, but they're almost always just brought back over to layer 1 and for traditional laundering methods. We're starting to see some native layer 2 mixers and things like that, but at this point, almost always, when it comes to any asset that's stolen, we almost always see them basically converted to some sort of stable coin fairly quickly. So then at that point, it's really the same kind of traditional cryptocurrency investigation that we've been doing for years. And then some of the obfuscation techniques that we see lately. Also, one of the most successful ones that we've seen recently in some of these Shah Pan scams is the networks of pseudo OTCs. So we'll see a number of small traders that are operating like OTCs, basically trading all with each other to kind of further obfuscate the source of those funds before going through a more established OTC for the deposits into exchanges. That gives, from the exchange's perspective, they might see these funds and know that this is a legitimate OTC. We've seen them doing business for years, but they might have, some percentage of that exposure to stolen funds, and so that makes it a little bit complicated, for explaining that to law enforcement as well as explaining that to the exchange that, they might be going through this more legitimate OTC at the end, but if you can see this network before it, we can see that this is, a handful of investors here, a handful of traders just trading these stolen funds kind of back and forth to try and obfuscate from, the source of the funds. So that's probably one of the bigger challenges that we see in terms of laundering these days. Of course, mixers have always been the cat and mouse game for investigators versus crypto criminals, money launderers. We'll get better at manual demixing. There are some tools that can do some demixing, and you can do some volume and timing analysis. But that's always going to be kind of the one of the biggest challenges, is, when mixers are used properly, oftentimes, we see cyber criminals using these mixers, but sometimes they'll mix post-mix funds with pre-mixed funds and basically essentially bypass all of the work that they've done. That's getting more rare. More cyber criminals are becoming savvy at how to use these mixers properly, not spending any toxic change, in the case of Wasabi. So we have to be sharp, and oftentimes speed is of the essence there. If we're investigating a theft or a scam or something like that, if we can catch those funds and monitor them, potentially before they're mixed, and then we can watch, especially if they're flooding the mixer, they might have considerably more volume than any other investors that are putting money into that mixer that day. Then at that point, we can kind of look at the outputs over the next day or two, couple of days, and start looking at, are they aggregating any of these funds, and start identifying these real potential outputs from those mixers. So that's continuously, one of the situations that we face as investigators. And then some proactive measures to stay ahead of these new tactics. I think one of the best proactive measures that we can do is just continue to network and build relationships within the industry and within law enforcement. One of the challenges to that is, that sometimes we see an attitude, with law enforcement where, they don't necessarily trust private investigation firms, or think that they alone kind of have to shoulder all of that that investigation responsibility. We are here to help and support law enforcement. We have years of experience here. You know, I know that there are a number of scam investigators essentially that are trying to do what we call recovery room scams. You know, where they'll advertise that they can get funds back for victims, essentially take more money and then run off. And you know, sometimes they might provide some information, but it's either not useful or it's you know, outright just inaccurate. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we face is kind of that lack of trust. So the more networking we do, you know, the more relationships we build, the more relationships are built between different law enforcement agencies so that we can share that data, link some of these cases that, you know, might have victims across the world, the better we're going to be at investigating and prosecuting those criminals. And then let's see, I think,
Justin, before we jump into the investigation process, I just want to get Matt's thought on this as well. I mean, at least from Merkle Science, I think the data accuracy and data availability is another key concern, right? There's a lot of tools that cover various different chains, various different tokens. So it's very important to have a multi-vendor kind of model here where you're able to not only just validate for yourself if the data is similar or you're seeing the same results in different tools. And maybe that's one of the patterns that is becoming more and more apparent now. But Matt, I guess from your perspective, would you say that, you know, all of these are equally prominent? What have you kind of seen that really sticks out in terms of gaps or knowledge that you would impart on a law enforcement agency or anyone who's an early stage investigator trying to really bring some expertise into the space?
Yeah, I think Justin raised several good points, and one I think is a very, very key point, very important point, is the global nature of these types of investigations. We see this in crypto cases and cyber cases in general, are that very rarely do we ever see a 100% domestic case where a threat actor lives within the United States and operates within the United States and all the money moves within the United States. If that were the case, these would be very simple. They'd be very straightforward. All the U.S. Legal documentation that we have to go through in court orders and subpoenas and search warrants and all those types of things, it would be very cut and dry, and we would be able to work these cases very quickly and efficiently. But then anytime we're forced to operate outside of the U.S. borders, it becomes very difficult. And there's several issues there. And Justin touched on a couple of them. And one I think that's also very significant is the inherent lack of trust that law enforcement has outside of law enforcement circles, right? We are definitely, at least when I was with Homeland Security, we were dependent on companies like Justin's to provide technical expertise because we did not have the in-house expertise amongst government law enforcement hired employees, that they're not crypto tracing experts. That's not what they do 24/7, all the time. They do it on an ad hoc basis amongst all their other, intelligence related tasks that are assigned to them. And in order to become a true SME in this field, I think you have to be doing it day in and day out. So we had lots of contractors, but those contractors were vetted. They went through a security process through the US and we could trust them. I think particularly outside of the Five Eyes regions, that level of trust becomes less and less. And you really have to work on establishing some level of trust with people, joining task forces, meeting, getting out there, shaking hands, and understanding who can I trust, because you're never going to be able to do it on your own. And I think there are still some law enforcement people, investigators, agents who think that, hey, I can do this on my own, and you're never going to get there. The second point is the cases are very dynamic and they're very fast moving, right? If you see a scam, and this has been true since even and this is true even in fiat cases like BEC, anytime money's moving, right? And even more so in the crypto space because of the very liquid nature of crypto, it's instantaneous, right? You can move millions of dollars in a matter of seconds now. And you don't have time to wait to draft a mutual legal assistance treaty, send it to a foreign nation. It goes in, and a month later it lands on some investigator's desk. It's too late at that point. So and that's kind of what law enforcement is used to, right? When we're working a lot of traditional law enforcement investigations, we're used to it's part of government. It's very bureaucratic. You're used to, hey, I got to fill this form out. It's got to be signed by an attorney. It's got to go out. It's got to hit, the embassy or the desk of whoever. And you don't have that luxury working these types of cases. So like Justin said, you're forced to form relationships and find somebody outside of the US that you can trust to say, hey, I'm working this case. I think this infrastructure lives within your country. Can you reach out and get something back? And you're never going to be 100% sure, but something's better than nothing, right? And if you're forced to go through the traditional channels, a lot of times it's going to be too late, and then you're going to get zero.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really important aspect here, is that we really have to act fast. And it's not that, I think law enforcement doesn't know that. I think that there are some very crypto savvy officers and agents now who know that we need to do this quickly, but are maybe held up by the process that's kind of based on more traditional investigations. Any of the successful outcomes we've had that have resulted in funds being frozen or recovered almost exclusively could not have happened if they relied on law enforcement alone. We have the agility to watch all of these transfers, to monitor them, to set alerts, so that instantly when that transfer happens and we see it land at an exchange or some service, we can immediately send in real time that information to law enforcement and ask them to send a subpoena, or a freeze request. We don't obviously have that authority to send that, but we can provide that information. And if they can act on it quickly, which I think is one of the biggest challenges, is getting them to send that subpoena, oftentimes, within 48 hours. Sometimes some of these exchanges, we've worked with them for years. We've built these relationships. They know that they can trust our analysis. So they might honor our request to say, this is stolen funds, please freeze this. I'm letting law enforcement know. And they'll say, well, you have 48 hours for law enforcement to reach out or send us a subpoena. So that's a very short time window to get something official sent out.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few agencies out there that are trying to kind of lead the way here, right? So FinCEN has their 314B, which is basically an inbound method of financial institutions basically reporting any type of malicious actors, specifically as it relates to terrorist activity or money laundering. Obviously, these are programs that need to be built from the ground up. Getting these in real time is a completely other story, right? It's not like you can just do an API call out to a government agency. Some of these agencies are still very dependent on legacy systems, like even email, faxes, like that's how they're getting this reporting. So, I mean, generally, I think that is an area of improvement. But yeah, I think that's a good transition point over to the actual investigation process, right? So we've talked about some of the challenges, some of the gaps. Now, let's talk about like what are the steps that typically are involved in an investigation process. And maybe, Justin, while you're going through this, give us some context around the two different versions of this, right? One is where you guys have identified or found a malicious actor, and you want to report this to a law enforcement agency, and then the other one being where you're actually hired or contracted out to do an investigative process. So, would love to see you dive into those bullet points here.
Certainly. So typically, first steps in any kind of investigation or incident response like this is, we'll have either the victim themselves reach out to us and say, we need help with, XYZ, this is what happened. I was scammed, or my wallet was hacked and all my funds were stolen. Or we might have an attorney who's representing that victim reach out to us, or sometimes even law enforcement themselves are like, we need help with this. I mean, that's a little bit more rare, but we've built some good relationships. So sometimes, some of the officers or agents that we've worked with in the past might know, okay, these people have some good information. Maybe they can help us a little bit with this investigation. So first, they'll reach out to us, and the first thing we're going to do is reach out and gather as much information about the situation as we can. We want to be able to scope that. We're going to do a little preliminary analysis just to see how complex does this situation look like, right from the start. Do we see any mixers involved? How much chain hopping do we see? Are there long peel chains? Does it look like this is just targeting one victim? Do we see a lot of payments in that are not just the victim's payments? They're possibly targeting multiple victims around the world. So we just try to get a good understanding of the situation and how big this is, so that we can accurately provide an estimate about how long this is going to take, for us to do the analysis, write up a report. We want to find out how many, who else is involved in this. Have they already reported this to law enforcement? Their local law enforcement as well as federal. Have they reported this, filed a report on IC3? If they're in the U.S. Basically, we just want to know all of the facts about the case right from the start. At that point, once we've got all of that, we basically engaged that client and started this investigation. We'll hand that off to a lead investigator. We assign out those cases based on expertise. Typically, different investigators have different areas of expertise. If this is a heavily DeFi case, we might go with one of our investigators that's really passionate about DeFi. If it looks like it involves mixers, we have investigators that specialize in demixing. So we then assign out to a lead investigator who's going to be that main point of contact with the client, and with law enforcement or any attorneys that are involved. Then we'll set up a kickoff call just so we can all get on the same page. We can explain what we do in this process versus what law enforcement does. We'll explain what we're going to provide and the time frames that we're going to provide that information. And basically just clear up any kind of misconceptions right from the start, manage expectations, that people don't think that, they're going to hire us and then, days later, we're going to return all of their stolen funds. That's kind of a misconception sometimes, in terms of like what people think is possible with these investigations or how quickly they go. Sometimes building a criminal investigation, against some of these scammers and then bringing that all the way through prosecution, potentially, arrest and seizing assets and all these things. This can take years sometimes in some cases. So we need to be upfront about that, once you hire us, we're probably not going to be able to get these funds back, right away. And there's never a chance where it's 100% chance that we'll get funds back at all. We have to let people know that right up front. So then, we do the investigation. We trace that out at least right away within the first day or two. We'll trace the funds out to where they hit every service, that first layer of services. Typically, we see perpetrators in these cases use multiple types of services to launder these funds, because we obviously can't trace through services. So once they're deposited to that service, we document all of the deposit information and send that over to law enforcement. At that point, law enforcement needs to send out subpoenas for that transaction information and that account information, find out were those assets converted to something else? Were they just withdrawn directly and then continue that tracing process? Were they cashed out to fiat? Oftentimes at that first stage, we just see them deposited to a service and then withdrawn right away. But we need to wait on those subpoena returns. So what that serves to do is really just slow down investigators, and build some buffer for them where they can kind of get ahead of us. So that's why it's crucial that we work with law enforcement, and that they act quickly to get those subpoenas out. Most exchanges at this point are very comfortable answering those subpoenas and get information back fairly quickly. And at that point, then we start essentially what we'd consider phase 2, basically doing that same process, tracing it out to every mixer, following all of the peel chains, and we will repeat that process until we find the final kind of cash out point. And then at that point, we produce the full final report, detail all of the analysis that was done, all of the transaction information, the chain of custody, and why we believe that along this chain of transfers, this did not change hands, or if it did, these are associates that clearly know each other. They're clearly working together. This is part of the same organization, and why we believe that. Detail all of that information and then provide that report both to the client and to law enforcement, and then let them kind of take the investigation from that point.
Thanks, Justin. So I want to just double click on something that you said. So obviously you're providing this as evidence that can be used to obviously take someone down. Let's talk about the accuracy and the confidence behind that. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you because I'm specifically alluding to the chain analysis CipherTrace article that had come out a little while back, right? So there was a situation where the head of investigations at chain analysis was questioned about how their methodology on how they determined the attribution and the level of risk associated to that individual and the accuracy of the data and how it would be used in court. So obviously the answer that was given wasn't satisfactory, but Matt, maybe you can shed some more light on some of the nuances when you're doing this investigation and how that confidence of the attribution really takes place. And any other insights you can provide around the heuristics element of this.
Yeah, I think just in general, when you think about forensics, it's really the presentation of scientific discovery into evidence, and then presenting it into a court of law. And I think there's they throw that term around very loosely, the term of forensics. I was a digital forensics investigator, analyst, very early on I started in 2004. And, back then, a lot of the process was manual, or it had to be done manually. And I think we've seen a lot of automation built into a lot of tools that are used. And I think a lot of analysts and investigators don't necessarily understand the automation that is happening. I know that, as forensic tools got better and better and better, and they automated more and more of the process that you had to do manually, you still had to understand what was going on, what that automation was. Because when you go to testify in court, if you've never had to testify as an expert witness before, anything that you put in a report, a judge and jury and prosecution and defense attorneys are going to be able to expect you to be able to explain that and explain it in a manner that is understood by a layman, in layman's terms. And if you don't, you're going to come in, you're going to have issues. You're going to be subject to a very intense, high level of scrutiny by, whatever side, if you're representing the prosecution, the defense prosecution. And so I think people need to be very careful in understanding that if I push a button and I get a result, what happened? If I'm going to take that result and testify, I need to have at least a cursory understanding, if not more, on what is going on there. I was always trained that you never trust the tool's result in and of itself. You always verify it. So we would use, in Homeland Security investigations, they used several tracing tools, so that if you trace something with one tool, you verify that result with another, preferably, two, to say, hey, all three are getting the same result. I feel very confident. And then if possible, you go back and actually trace it on the chain manually and see, hey, what's going on here? And then I think courts become much more confident and at ease if you can explain things like that. Where they start to get uneasy, and particularly judges generally don't tend to be the youngest, most tech savvy people in the world. And if they think there's any sort of hocus pocus, wizardry going on that can't be explained, they don't like it. And once the judges don't like it and they don't want to introduce it as evidence, prosecutors don't want to accept it. So we started to see more and more prosecutors that are like, hey, you can't just print out a report from a tracing tool and say, hey, this is the gospel. Boom, here you go, jury. This is accepted. No, we don't like that. We need to know exactly what that tool is doing. And once they've been burnt a couple times, it's going to come even a higher level of scrutiny. And I think that's really, I think that comes with experience, having testified over and over again, particularly if you encounter a couple really hard cross-examinations. And so I would just really recommend for people who are in this space to verify their results and make sure they really have an understanding of what's going on. And a couple points that Justin raised on the IR process too, that I think are really significant for people that are on this call, is that you really want to have a plan in place as early as possible, right? And so I worked at an IR company, a cyber IR company. I led operations there, and the vast majority of our cases were ransomware cases. And the more of a plan that you have before you're attacked, or the quicker if you don't have a plan, the quicker you're able to make a call and get somebody involved in the IR process, the better. What you don't want to have happen is 2-3 days later, you're having all these internal meetings and discussions and freaking out and going crazy and trying to figure out what to do. So if you have a substantial amount of crypto assets in your company, in your exchange, whoever you are, the time to have a plan on what to happen if you're attacked or if somebody makes a mistake or something happens is not after the event, it's beforehand. And that's gonna, I mean, I know we sold incident response retainers where people would come to us and say, hey, you know, we want to have you on retainer so if something happens, and then we would outline what that agreement would look like. Having something like that in place, just in case, is going to really give you a lot of peace of mind. And maybe you don't you never have to use it, and that's great. But if you do get attacked, the faster you're able to respond and stop the bleeding, the better. And so I would just really make a recommendation for anybody that's listening to really consider that now, as opposed to when you think you're going to need it after the fact.
Yeah, great points. The other recommendation I think for listeners on the call here is to make sure that you know the methodologies that are being used by the tracing software, know how the attribution takes place, understand how those risks are calculated. Here at Merkle Science, we're publishing our attribution methodology publicly so that everyone can see how the black box works. We don't want it to be a black box. We want it to be clear. And that's the only way we can get to a transparent and more effective future of investigation here. So Justin, back over to you. I think you wanted to go through maybe another slide or two.
Yeah, certainly. I guess I wanted to touch on the case building and prioritization. I think we've kind of touched on, you know, the tools. You know, we try to use as many tools as possible. I think you're entirely accurate. You know, it's useful for tool providers to publish how they do the attributions. You know, so the people don't think this is, you know, some magic, you know, and somehow some AI came up with this. You know, oftentimes this attribution is direct transactions, you know, with these entities. And then something simple like co-spend heuristics. It's, you know, so the attribution is very, we're very confident that the results are accurate. You know, but you know, some people don't know that or know how the tool works, you know, under the hood. So, but yeah, let me go into some of the case prioritization. So when we take on cases, we have a queue of potential clients that are asking for our help. We try to prioritize our resources toward the best chances of successful recovery. So that's almost always going to be the most recent. You know, as we've touched on multiple times in the presentation, acting fast is probably one of the most important things you can do with these. So we always try and prioritize the most recent cases that come in, which is not to say that we haven't had very successful results on cases that are sometimes years old. And sometimes we'll even as we develop new methodologies for analysis, as tools come out with new features, as mixers are sometimes reverse engineered, and we can, with more confidence, demix them. As we come up with these new things, we'll often revisit some older cases to see if we see any new results. Some of these cases last years, especially when you're talking about like exchange hacks and big large thefts like that. You'll often see these perpetrators sitting on dormant funds for months or years even, especially when we look at DPRK hacks, Lazarus attack. They'll often sit on some of these stolen funds for years before they start moving them again. So that gives us an opportunity to, as we develop new methodologies, to apply that, see if we can find any additional funds that may have been, not traced out, or maybe lost along the way. So we'll go back and revisit those, and we've had some good results there. But we do try to prioritize the most recent. Let's see. And then, this is just kind of a little bit of a reiteration. The biggest issues in that investigation process. Some of I actually didn't mention the exposure issues. So some of this, it would be pretty neat if some tools had the ability to show some exposure, beyond bridges, beyond DeFi token swaps, and carry that exposure through. Even instant swappers, some instant swappers that are public about those the transfers, and you can just kind of see this asset was swapped for this asset and went to this address. In those type of cases, if that were in the tool and you could configure your exposure calculation, it would be easier to explain that to law enforcement, that these are still the same funds. And easier for them to then trust our results and get those subpoenas out quicker. And then again, the pseudo OTCs, that's kind of an ongoing issue, really should be pretty trivial to stop these. Just the analysis itself is not hard, but it's just getting law enforcement often to trust our results, that these are not legitimate businesses, get the exchanges to trust that these are not legitimate businesses. They're a small network, essentially, of money launderers in some cases. So we see that often in Shazupan scams, which, to touch on those, that at this point, Shazupan scams have really been on the rise over the last couple of years. I've been following these for probably 4 years now, and they're just getting bigger and bigger. At this point, I would say probably 80% of the cases that come into CipherBlade are some sort of romance scam or investment scam, long-term scam like a Shazupan. And then mixers, and then again, lack of international cooperation as well as cooperation with private industry. And I think that's that was the last one there.
Wonderful. Thanks, Justin. So changing gears a little bit, let's talk about some of the best practices. Obviously, we've been touching on a few of them, but Matt, I'll turn it over to you. What are some of the other best practices that you would recommend to the audience? What are strategies? What are some tools? What are some techniques that you've kind of developed over the years that you would recommend that our audience put into place? I know we've been touching on some of them, but so maybe we can just do a quick run through of a summary of those, and you can start off with some of the top ones that you've seen work really well.
Yeah, I think automated alerting, and just knowing what all your assets are and where they are, and staying on top of it. I think as we've seen in a lot of I saw in a lot of ransomware attacks and crypto exchange attacks, and that just following a lot of basic cyber hygiene, I think, is very preventative in a lot of those cases. A lot of them are literal, one-on-one type cybersecurity, what not to do, single factor authentication, password reuse, credential reuse, that type of thing. I think that it just stems from a lot of people being lazy and just foregoing tighter controls in the favor of just wanting ease of use. And I think that a lot of those major type attacks could have been prevented. And then I think just staying on top, understanding of what's going on in the industry, staying educated. A lot of the scams, you're very rarely victim number one. And so seeing what's going on in the space, paying attention to the news and all of the latest and greatest on what's going on, is really helpful. We just noticed that, scammers never waste an opportunity for a new scam to come on whatever news cycle or whatever events are going on out in the world. We saw a ton of it during the early stages of COVID. And so just be on guard, that when you're getting emails, you're getting texts, you're getting those types of messages, that you want to always be skeptical when those types of things bounce up out of the blue.
Yeah, I would reiterate that as well. I think, if people are just more educated to what red flags to look for, we would have less people falling victim to some of these scams. I think part of it is the fear of missing out. If people are just learning about crypto now, they feel like everyone has basically made a bunch of money and they missed out on it. They might be willing to take more risks than they should and overlook some red flags that they probably should have noticed. Typically no one is just reaching out that doesn't know you, trying to offer you money. No one's going to double your money if you send them some. No one that you don't know is offering you a chance to invest in something that is going to double and triple and 10 times your money. That's just, so I think just being cautious, being skeptical would prevent a lot of this.
Yeah, agreed. So I wanted to jump into a few questions here. First, I just wanted to clarify the Shazupan is essentially pig butchering. So it's like Justin mentioned, it can be romance scams, it can be various other forms. There are more modern takes on it where it's like people are using deep fakes or faking voices of like your kids asking you for money. It can come in a lot of different variety of forms. And the best way to avoid all of these is just not to respond. If you think it's a legitimate person, if it's a family member, just call them, right? Call them directly or send a message directly to them and verify that it's the right person that you're talking to. So we have a few questions I want to jump through here. First and foremost, what are some resources that both of you would recommend in terms of hypothetical examples for transactions that investigators could practice on, or just historically start taking a look at of some of these investigations and how they happen, and how can our audience really identify training material that would be appropriate for their team? So would love to get both of your perspective. Maybe Justin, let's start with you. What are some resources that you think would be valuable for everyone to start taking a look at?
I guess it depends on your existing level of crypto knowledge. Fortunately, we live in this internet age where you can learn almost everything about crypto, and how it works for free on the internet. There are tons of great YouTube videos that walk through this, in a very simple way. That's probably one of the best places to start. After that, there are a number of tool providers that teach crypto fundamentals. So the basic course, once you have a basic concept of how it works, they'll take that next step. And then, there are also those providers as well as some tool agnostic training at that point that can really take it the next steps. And then there are a couple of providers also that provide very advanced level crypto investigation training.
Yeah, and I would agree with Justin. There's tons of resources out there, and a lot of it is free. It costs you nothing to spin up a wallet, and for very minimal account, you can set up an account on an exchange, dump like $5-10 in there, an amount of money you don't care about losing. move it around, move it from wallet to wallet, play around with it, see how it works. And I think that really gives you a better understanding than just, reading a news article or the theoretical application of it. You actually get to see it in motion. You can chain hop, you could do all kinds of stuff, and then the light bulb, I think, really goes off.
Yeah, just to be clear, we're not recommending anyone go out and get scammed. Don't fall for any of the scams. That's not the best way to learn. Learn from other people's mistakes first. Sorry, Justin, go ahead.
I was going to add on to that. Do those transactions yourself. Set up different types of wallets because they all operate differently, and then look at them in a tool like Merkle Science. See how they look when they're visualized, so that you can start recognizing the patterns of how funds move, what different DeFi token swaps look like, what different wallets look like when they send out funds. Do they create a new address for that change and send it there? Different ones operate differently, so you just kind of dig in there and get that firsthand experience.
Got it. Let's do another question from the audience. So this one is from Anonymous. What is the play for exchanges who wait for law enforcement requests before freezing funds, right? So an example would be an exchange that doesn't honor these types of requests, right? So they might get a subpoena and they might not respond immediately. There might be some delays. What have both of your experiences been with those type of exchanges or third parties?
I can go. There were exchanges that were dead ends I was just going to say there's exchanges that were dead ends for the longest time. Luckily, I would say now less so than there were in the early days. We had exchanges that were just absolutely anti-law enforcement that wouldn't reply to any paperwork whatsoever. A lot of those have been seized and taken off. And now I think a lot of the exchanges, they make so much more money with legitimate transactions than they do with illegitimate, which was not the way it was back in 2011 or the early stages. So we see less and less of that basic, complete, hey, we're going to be unresponsive to everything. But it's very difficult, honestly. A lot of, you have to hope that Ellie has a contact maybe in that country specifically. Like, I think of one is like PRC. If we were able to send a notice to our attaché office in Beijing and say, hey, is there any way somebody that may be able to get something back for us on that? But otherwise, I mean, it's very unfortunate and it can be very heartbreaking. But a lot of times on a lot of the scam cases, it may hit a dead end where we're just never going to be able to recover your money, no matter how much time or effort or what we put into it. And so a lot of times you do hit dead ends like that.
Yeah, I would second that. I don't think we see it as much now. I agree. More exchanges are more cooperative with law enforcement in general. But oftentimes, when those funds do hit some of those non-cooperative exchanges, there's really nothing we can do. It's kind of a dead end at that point. So fortunately, there are fewer of those because unfortunately, there's not much we can do then.
Cool. Let's do maybe one more question. So what role does OSINT play in your investigation? So for anyone who doesn't know what OSINT is, it's just open source intelligence. What kind of tools do you guys use? And then the second part of that question is, what role does IP addresses and device monitoring play in your investigations? Maybe I'll touch on that second piece. It's very rare to have IP address and device data. Unless you're working very closely with the actual exchange, right? So they have to be collecting that data in their app or in their browser. Usually that's not available. It's a luxury at this point, but would love your thoughts on it. How often are those data points available to you? Especially IP is even more rare. But how often does OSINT kind of come into those investigations, and what are some services that you both would recommend?
I think OSINT is certainly important. It's not the most important part of this, but oftentimes we'll get some additional information. Maybe a Bitcoin Talk forum has been scraped, and we find that this address has been mentioned in association with some other sort of case. or on Reddit or YouTube or wherever the case may be. So sometimes it'll give us new leads where we can follow in a new direction that we don't necessarily see just on chain, because there might be a post that mentions this address, but also a couple of others, and there's no actual on-chain interaction between those. But that gives us a whole nother avenue to start looking down.
I think where it comes in useful on the law enforcement side is on the attribution side to a specific person, when you're actually looking at who is the actual person sitting behind the keyboard. Because at the end of the day, in a law enforcement investigation, you're hoping to indict somebody for a criminal offense, and we can't indict monikers or fictitious names or whatever. You have to have an actual person. So a lot of time the crypto tracing leads us up to who we think that person is, and then the OSINT fills in the gap. OSINT in combination with paid tools and law enforcement databases and other stuff that's not necessarily public available. I think all of that together helps create the full picture on the attribution side. But I would agree with Justin, the tracing of the proceeds or the money is by far and away the most significant part. And then the rest of it just kind of fills in the picture.
And IP data also, although it is rare, when we get that IP information from an exchange, they might have device and IP information. It isn't necessarily as helpful on the blockchain tracing side, but it does allow law enforcement to they can now subpoena the ISP and verify that this is the same person that has this account that also has this exchange account, that they might have already suspected for other reasons as well.
Wonderful. We have about 3 minutes left, so maybe let's just do one final question. This one is a good one. What would you say the rate of cases has been over the past couple of months or past couple of years? Have you seen a general trend of increasing investigations? What are specific chains or tokens that you guys have been kind of focusing on, where I guess there's been a little bit more illicit activity? Not to call out Tron, but Tron. Yeah, would love to get a better understanding of what has been the volume so far. How many cases have you guys kind of if you're willing to share, obviously. But maybe Matt, let's start with you.
Yeah, I would say in general, the trend has been to more and more, criminal groups have just been using crypto in general, where we would see people who, normally it was very cyber specific, very cyber savvy types of groups, ransomware actors, people selling initial access, initial access brokers, hackers, dark web vendors or whatever. What we've seen, and particularly in the last 5 years, are drug cartels and street gangs, Bloods and Crips, all kinds of people now. It's become completely widely adopted because of the ability to move money so quickly. And then obviously the move from Bitcoin into various forms of altcoins and technology. They're always trying to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. They learn how law enforcement does attribution and figures out who they are, and then they make a change, right? And then so it becomes this constant game of cat and mouse.
Yeah. And in terms of which assets I think that we see mostly in these type of cases, regardless of what assets are stolen or scammed, or we almost always see them converted to a stable coin. So, and almost always USDT. I think that's probably the most common theme that we see through all of our investigations. These perpetrators try to lock in the value that they've stolen as quick as possible. One of the things that's kind of interesting about USDT is that it is possible to get frozen anywhere on the chain and recovered. The criteria for doing that is still very high. You have to be able to prove that these are the stolen funds, that they're not commingled with any other victims. Because the Tether Foundation is not trying to freeze any innocent people's money. So the bar is pretty high, but it is possible to get funds frozen in place anywhere on the USDT chain. But we do see that fairly often. Additionally, we'll see when it comes to the money laundering part of it after the funds are stolen, sometimes even before converting to USDT, We'll see them put it through, into Bitcoin and go through a mixer there, or into Ethereum and go through Tornado Cash or something like that. Just a couple of different obfuscation steps before they lock in that value.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we are all out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you, panelists, for all of your great